the place where we recite each other's poetry, not just that from our own tradition, the place where we vote for those who don't actually look like us, the place where we celebrate rather than fear difference and diversity, the hopeful image of Northern Ireland in the future, not of Sri Lanka or Jerusalem today. So taken together, civil society is simultaneously a goal to aim for, the good society, a partial means to achieve it through voluntary action, and a framework for engaging with each other about ends and means in the public sphere. Because we will never agree with each other on the details of what constitutes the good society, still less how to reach it. Take a very small example, the peace walls that Nuala mentioned this morning. Do you keep them up, celebrate them, paint them, use them as a tourist attraction, or do you tear them down and get rid of them for good? That's an issue for the public to decide. We need all three of these understandings, and we need to know how they fit together in each particular context. In other words, how does a strong civil society produce a society that is strong and civil? And the answer that emerges to that question from many different geographical and cultural experiences lies in a certain kind of voluntary action that is politically engaged in the broadest and deepest sense and motivated by universal values of love and compassion, of cooperation, solidarity and sharing. Now, we usually think of those things, especially perhaps love and politics, as diametrically opposed. Right? You can have one or the other, but you can never have both. But it was Martin Luther King's great achievement, I think, to unite them in one single reflexive process, which he called the love that does justice. In that process, personal transformation and social transformation reinforce each other. In other words, we are searching for ways to develop both the personal qualities that are required to practice politics and civic life in new ways, and the civic and political institutions that reward and nurture the qualities and values we see as most important for a successful collective future. They go together. And by doing this, we can liberate ourselves from the constraints of our narrow identities, from the practice of politics as business as usual, from the use of democracy to impose majority views, and from the social Darwinism that aims to impose market competition on public life and the not-for-profit sector. Instead, our life's mission, King said, is to translate love into justice structures. It's a phrase in one of his later speeches. Our life's mission is to translate love into justice structures, to find ways, in other words, to infuse the material world with a different rationality that opens the way to genuinely boundary-breaking solutions. Now, it may seem strange to think of love as the basis for any activity outside the family. It's almost embarrassing to talk about it with a capital letter. But King wasn't talking, obviously, about romantic love or love of and for our children. He was talking about unconditional love that knows no boundaries of kin or affiliation, expressed through non-violent action, interdependence, equality, and human rights for all. And like Gandhi and others before him, King saw love as the only force capable, really capable, of achieving and sustaining large-scale social progress without internalizing the fear and insecurity that underpins oppression in all of its forms, and so starting the self-defeating cycle afresh. He saw that this could become the source of a radically different form of politics that does not try to bury or distance its opponents, but looks for opportunities to welcome and engage with those who have a different view and to struggle with them towards some form of imperfect, constantly evolving consensus. And that's exactly what characterises the few successful episodes of liberating politics the world has witnessed over the last 40 years or so. From the civil rights movement in the United States, to the negotiations that led to the end of apartheid in South Africa, to the peace process that's ongoing here in Northern Ireland. On March the 11th, 2009, wrote Robin Wilson recently on the website Open Democracy, large crowds in Belfast and other cities across the region attended lunchtime rallies organised by the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. There was the universal language of human solidarity and principled hostility to all violence, and that, in the end, will prevail. Close quote. Just as it's prevailing, as we heard this morning, in Lockview, in Ballinderry, and in thousands of other communities near and far. This is what's happening now in the United States, inspired not only by a very different president, obviously, Barack Obama, but by a new generation of activists and non-profit groups who know that they can win with love, as they put it in a phrase, without sacrificing their principles. A love that seeks not to accumulate power, even in the face of oppression, but to transform it, so that victory means more than a game of revolving chairs between narrow political interests. The decision to grow into a new shared identity, even as we keep hold of elements of who we already are, is always an act of deep personal courage, and therefore of love for the world. The strength to stay the course when the going gets tough, when the inevitable backsliding begins, when the forces ranged against you seem overwhelming and unstoppable, that also comes from love. The radical equality consciousness that breaks down all distance and hierarchy is rooted in love, a love that respects the necessary self-empowerment of others, eschews paternalism and romanticism for relationships of truth and authenticity, even when they move through phases of conflict and disagreement, as all do. This is a love that encourages us to live up to our social obligations as well as our individual moral values, connect our interior life worlds to those public spaces, encourage collective judgments, and create open networks of self-reflective and critical communication. Love releases us from fear and insecurity and our diminished normal sense of self. Love gives us optimism and hope, an expansion rather than contraction of our critical faculties, openness instead of closure, because the first duty of love, as Paul Tillich reminds us, is always and simply to listen. We may never share, and we probably never will share, a common vision of ends and means in civil society or in politics and the public sphere, but we can all be committed to a process that allows everyone to share fairly in defining how those differences are reconciled. Can love really be the wellspring of new forms of civic and political engagement that can eventually create a new public sense of self as an opening into a different collective future? We don't know the answer to that question, but we can turn the question around and ask ourselves whether new experiments in what I call civic politics that are already in operation in different parts of the world provide a healthier alternative to the status quo. Do they nurture and encourage the habits of the heart, as Robert Bellah described them in his studies of civil society in America? Do they produce a fairer political consensus and lead to better outcomes for minorities and majorities over time? Can we organise the political world so that people can be true to their deepest beliefs while living in peace with others? Is that possible? Can we organise the political world so that people can be true to their deepest beliefs while living in peace with others? Well, the first part of the answer to that question, I think, lies through new forms of politics that allow everyone to participate in debate and decision-making in a meaningful way without confusing voice with vote. In other words, without trying to replace the functions of representative democracy, as David Blunkett reminded us this morning, with an even messier civic equivalent in which voluntary groups join the formal competition for political power that has been tried in different parts of the world, but never successfully. These new forms of politics have blossomed across the world during the last 10 years. They include deliberative opinion polls and public dialogues around especially contentious issues, new accountability mechanisms like municipal scorecards or public hotlines for complaints, experiments with devolution, you know well, which has sprung up everywhere, from Scotland to Indonesia, and participatory budgeting, one of the first innovations that has been imported from the developing world, there's a reversal, in this case Brazil, to the industrialised world, including the United Kingdom and the United States, where 31 out of 50 states, covering 70% of the American population, now permit citizens through voluntary associations, at least some say, in local government budgeting and budget accountability processes. And not surprisingly, that has resulted in increased allocations to health, to education, to social security, and so on, thereby delivering genuine improvements in people's lives and encouraging them to be active citizens, because only from security are people willing able to reach out and make new connections with others. If there is no security, if that doesn't happen, then disenchantment with devolution quickly sets in, particularly in the years following a political settlement. And I hear some echoes of that problem in Northern Ireland.